We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from July 31st, 2016. We continue our series called Define Church with Pastor Dax Bryant.
This is by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. This is the word of God. Please have a seat. I can't believe it's been this long ago, but I looked up the date, May 14th, 1998. I was a junior in college. That's surprising to me. Some of you think, oh, wow. But I remember it was late 90s, okay, and there was a TV show that was just at its peak in the late 90s, especially for college kids, but for really the whole nation, Seinfeld. Some of you heard of that, right? And May 14th, 1998 was the series finale of Seinfeld, and I still remember a whole big group of us crammed together in my little apartment around the TV to watch, the big series finale of Seinfeld. And I don't know if you remember how it went, but you have Jerry and George and Elaine and Kramer. They're in this plane, and they have to make an emergency landing in this small little town in Massachusetts, and so they're kind of stuck there in this little town waiting for the plane to be fixed. So they go for a walk, and they come across this overweight man who's being carjacked at gunpoint. And Kramer has a video camera, and so rather than helping the guy, Kramer films while the rest of the group just makes mean and sarcastic comments about his weight, right? And the victim notices that, and so when the responding police officer comes to take the report, he mentions to that police officer about these guys who just walked away. And the police officer arrests those four friends for violating this duty to rescue law. Right? And it sets up the whole rest of the show there from that finale. And it makes for a good story, but that's not really based in reality, this idea of a duty to rescue. In fact, well, at least not in this country it's not. The courts have found time and time and again that an innocent bystander does not have a legal obligation to help. You may have a moral or ethical obligation, but legally speaking, you do not have the obligation to help, to come to the rescue of another. And you can hear the echo of Cain's question to God in that, can't you? Am I my brother's keeper? And the common law in our country says, no, you're not. In fact, as an American, you are guaranteed the right not to act in the best interests of another. That's the law of our land. But the law of our land is not the ultimate standard that a Christian holds to, is it? There's a much higher law than that a Christian is held to. It's the law of Christ. It's the gospel. And especially when we think about, as Christians, the responsibility that we bear for one another in the church. 1 John 3:16 says it like this. Not John 3:16. 1 John 3:16 says, "By this we know love, that he," that is Jesus, "laid down his life for us, therefore we should lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters." Okay? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? Not according to the law of the land, but the gospel of Jesus Christ allows room for only one answer. Yes, I am. And God has given us a community, the church, in which to live out this gospel obligation. And let me clarify what I mean when I say church here, okay? That word church is used about 110 times in the New Testament. 90 of those or so are in direct reference to a local church. Did you realize that most of the letters that we call books in the New Testament are written directly to local churches? 3 of them that are not are written to pastors of local churches. Even the book of Acts outlines the establishment of local churches. The book of Revelation is a series of visions meant to comfort and encourage and strengthen 7 local churches. So my point is this. When you think about where do I live out my Christianity, it's in the context of the local church. Not the universal church, the big C church out there somewhere. The place where you most concretely demonstrate your Christian faith and responsibility for each other happens in the local church. That's exactly what we find when we come to Hebrews chapter 10. Up until this point here, for 9.5 chapters in Hebrews, the author has been proclaiming the all-surpassing greatness of Jesus Christ. More specifically, he's been spelling out what Jesus has achieved for us in his redeeming death and resurrection. And just before we get to the verses that we'll focus on this morning, verses 24 and 25, before we get there, the author sort of recaps and summarizes 2 of Jesus' gospel achievements, and that happens in verses 19 and 21. So very briefly, let me point those out to you here, okay? The first achievement, the first gospel achievement by Jesus Christ, you now have immediate access to God. That's verse 19. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, let's pause right there. Can you really know Jesus? Can someone like you get close to God? I mean, close enough to have a relationship with him? Have you ever thought about that kind of thing? For the believer, the answer to those questions is an unreserved yes. Why? Because of the finished work of Jesus Christ, it says here in verse 19. His death eradicates, wipes out the barrier that separates you from God. And more than that, it gives you confidence to enter his presence. That's the real point here in verse 19. You can enter in, okay? You can come close. You can know him right now, today. You can enter into God's presence. Immediate access to God is available to you through Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay? That's the first achievement. The second achievement, you have a perfect advocate working on your behalf before God. That's verse 21. You have a perfect advocate working on your behalf before God, since we have a great high priest over the house of God. Okay, so when we think about the gospel, not only did Jesus die, but he rose again from the dead 3 days later. He ascended to heaven, where he now sits at the right hand of the Father, advocating for you. Do you understand that? At this very moment, Jesus Christ is in God's presence as your advocate, as your defense attorney. Doing what? To ensure your eternal salvation. Okay, this is what Jesus has achieved for you. Direct access and immediate access to God and him as your advocate before God on your behalf. This is the gospel. But how should we respond to it? Do we have any obligations in light of it? Yes, we do. We absolutely do. And the author of Hebrews, he's got 3 specific things in mind here, okay? And they're easy to pick out in the text because they all start the same way. Look at the text there. They all begin with this phrase, let us. Okay? Now keep the flow of this in mind here, okay? We're reminded of the achievements of the gospel by Jesus Christ. That's verses 19 through 21, what we just looked at. And now, notice our response then to these gospel achievements, starting there in verse 22. Let us draw near. Okay? We're called to worship. That's the first response. Notice verse 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. We're called to persevere in the faith. That's the second response. And then lastly, verse 24. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. That's the third response. And that's what we're going to unpack here this morning, this third response, okay? Now, as you look at verse 24, your translation might say, let us consider how to stimulate one another, or spur one another on, Or it might say, let us consider how to motivate one another. It all kind of gets at the same idea, but the sense of the word here is really to provoke each other, to incite each other. So what it's saying is that in the light of Jesus' glorious gospel achievements, let us consider how to provoke each other. Let us consider how to incite each other. So one of our responses to the gospel is to provoke each other, to incite each other. To what? To what end? Look at the text, right? We are to stir up one another. We are to incite one another to love and good works. Okay, love. Love is that deep affection that you have that desires the greatest good for another. Good works is the practical outworking of that love, how you express that love to another. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Have you thought about this before? That this is one of your responses to the gospel. One of your responses to the gospel is to engage in this ministry of provoking and inciting each other toward love and good works. This is a gospel response. Have you thought about that? This is one of the reasons why we gather as a church. I mean, the church gathers for a lot of reasons, right? To worship God, to evangelize the world, to make disciples, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. But right here in Hebrews 10, we're given a specific reason as to why we gather. It's to incite each other, to provoke each other. Is this new for you? Maybe it's not, but just so that we all feel like we're in the same boat here, let's just assume that it is. Let's just pretend like this is new for everybody, okay? And so if you've never heard this, if you've never understood this as one of your responses to the gospel, this ministry of inciting each other, where do you start? How do you begin doing this? I want to show you 4 answers to that question, and that's really going to take up the rest of our time in this passage, okay? So how do you, if you've never done this before, if you've never engaged in this ministry of inciting and provoking each other to love and good works, where do you start? Number 1, recognize that this is your responsibility. Recognize that this is your responsibility, your obligation, not an option. Okay? Look at the text again here. Remember how this author of Hebrews laid out these gospel responses for us, right? As a result of Jesus' gospel achievements, verses 19 and 21. Verse 22, let us. Verse 23, let us. And verse 24, and let us. You notice a pattern? Each one of those gospel responses is in the first person plural, us. Us. Who? Us. That means that each one of these responses is binding, is mandatory for each one of us who has experienced the grace of God in the gospel. Okay, so this is not just a responsibility for church leaders. This is not just an obligation for certain personality types. This isn't just mandatory for those with particular spiritual gifts. This is the gospel obligation of every Christian, without exception. No exemptions, no caveats, no yeah, buts. No. This is a ministry for each of you who has experienced God's grace in the gospel. This ministry of inciting each other, of stirring up the other members of your local church toward love and good works. You are your brother's keeper, and he or she is yours. Now the question you have to ask yourself is, are you okay with that? After all, we live in Eastern Oregon. It's a place of rugged individualism, isn't it? We don't like to be told what to do. We don't like to be told what box we need to fit in. We like to chart our own course. And I get that. That's how I am too. And then we, maybe even as Christians, will talk about we desire community in the church, but do we really? Aren't there some of us who would maybe just prefer to come and go as we please? Aren't there some of us here that would really bristle at the notion of accountability and authority? What ideal do we hold higher than the right to say and think and feel whatever you want without judgment? You realize that Christianity calls for, no, Christianity demands something far different than that. We belong to each other as Christians. More than that, we are responsible for each other. This is a gospel obligation for each one of us, this ministry of inciting each other to love and good works. So if you've never done this before, where do you start? By recognizing this is your responsibility as a Christian. Number 2, recognize that this takes deliberate reflection. Recognize that engaging in this gospel ministry takes deliberate reflection. Verse 24 again. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. What does he mean, consider? We don't have to guess. He uses the same exact word way back in chapter 3, verse 1, where he tells us to consider Jesus. Now, when we think about what it means to consider Jesus, obviously the author's not saying, hey, look, I know you're really busy, but when you happen to get a free moment, just a free second, just maybe, give like an occasional glance or thought toward Jesus and you'll be good. That's not what he's saying, is it? No, to consider Jesus means to fasten your focus on him and really think about who he is and what he's done and what difference that makes in your life. To consider. Okay, this is a committed, intense reflection. It doesn't just happen. It takes effort. It takes concentration. Okay, and the point is, that's the same point he's making in verse 24, back in chapter 10. This ministry of inciting one another to love and good works, it doesn't just happen. It needs to be thought out. Intentional, not accidental. Purposeful, not random. Deliberate, not sporadic. Dare I say, planned? You understand what I mean? This kind of Christian living that's being talked about here doesn't just happen. If it did, every church would be equally caring and compassionate and loving. That's not the case, though, is it? This ministry takes deliberate reflection. It takes careful planning. This is something that we have to work at. That's what the author is getting at here. Consider this. There's an unfortunate idea, I think, that's really crept into the church. Not just this church, but Big C Church. And that is the idea that something can only be Spirit-led if it's spontaneous. Do you know what I mean? That if a worship service is carefully coordinated, that can't be of the Spirit. If a sermon is well thought out, that can't be of the Spirit. If a prayer is carefully composed, that can't be of the Spirit. So are we to conclude that things are only of the Spirit if they're chaotic and out of order? Of course not. Right? So you need to, it sounds good, it sounds really spiritual to say that, but you need to put that idea to death. That something like Christian love and compassion isn't real or isn't Spirit-led just because we're intentional about doing it. Okay, for this ministry of inciting each other to love and good works, for that ministry to be steady and consistent, we need to carefully consider how we do it. This is something that we deliberately reflect on, something that we carefully plan, that we purpose out to finish. Now, you have to be careful and don't go too far the other way, right? Don't start making excuses the other way. I can't do this. I'm not the kind of person who organizes my thoughts. This is not my gifting. That's not a valid excuse. Remember, this ministry is for each one of us who claims the name of Christian. And listen, this is really way easier than you think it is. God will use little old you to do this ministry of inciting each other. Okay, you don't know how many times I've finished preaching up here and thought, I blew that one. I mean, just, they were just blank stares looking back at me. I don't think I got through to anybody. And you just go, okay, well, there's another week. I felt like that a lot. Only sometimes days later, weeks later, to have somebody come up to me, every once in a while, even with tears in their eyes, and say, you don't know how God spoke to me through his word a couple weeks ago. Now, I never anticipate that. I never plan that. I never see that coming. It's certainly not anything I expect. I can't think of anything I said that would make that a valid response. But my point is this. This ministry of inciting each other doesn't require vast amounts of keen insight to people, okay? It's really this simple. You live in a fallen world. You are fallen. Everybody you know is fallen. Everybody in this room is fallen. Okay, so that means each one of us carries around some disappointment. Each one of us is susceptible to temptation. Each one of us is afraid of failure. Each one of us is ashamed of sin. Each one of us is needing to be loved. I want you to think about the people around you in this room right now. Think about the people sitting here right now. In our church, we are blessed to have a number of young families. We have a lot of empty nesters, too. We also have a significant group of single adults in our church. Just for example, when is the last time that you really considered their particular needs and struggles? When is the last time you thought about our single adults and the loneliness that they face? Or the desire for companionship that they have and the fear that will never come about? Or the temptation they may have towards self-centeredness? Or the struggle of a single parent? Look around. Guys, there are people in this room right now who are hurting financially. There are marriages that are fragile, just hanging by a thread. There are children who are, there are parents who are heartbroken over their wayward children. There are bodies that are chronically aching and ill. There are souls that are spiritually depressed and attacked. There are men and women everywhere fighting the lingering effects of years of slavery to any number of sins. And my point is, you don't need to be a mind reader to figure these things out. Okay? You don't need a counseling degree to understand these things. You just need to be a little less self-absorbed. You just need to look around a little bit. Just anticipate a little bit. Because chances are, whatever you're struggling with, there's somebody else in this church who's struggling with something very similar. And what I'm saying is, what the author here is saying is, think about this. Consider this. Consider these people, your church, and their particular needs. Okay? So if you've never done this kind of thing, how do you start? Number one, recognize this is your responsibility. Number two, recognize this requires careful deliberation. Third, recognize that this requires consistent togetherness. This ministry of inciting each other requires consistent togetherness. Verse 25. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day is drawing near. Now, did you notice something about verse 25 there? Something missing? Verse 25 does not start with that same familiar phrase, let us. See that? Why not? Because it's a continuation of verse 24. Verse 25 is not a new command. Verse 25 tells you how to carry out verse 24. So how do we carry out this command to consider how to stir up one another to love and good works? Verse 25 tells us. First, by ensuring that you are consistently present at the scheduled meetings of the church. We are to stir up one another to love and good works, verse 24. How? Verse 25, by not neglecting to meet together. It really is that simple. Your obligation, and it's an obligation, toward this ministry of inciting each other, to provoking each other to love and good works, can only be practiced when you make it a priority to consistently gather with the other people who are members of your local church. It means when the church meets, I meet. It refers to the scheduled meetings of the congregation. But there's one thing to notice here, okay? Notice this. Why is this stated in the negative? See it there? Not neglecting to meet together. Why in the negative? Well, look at the very next little phrase. As is the habit of some. Now, this is an astonishing statement here. You realize this letter to the Hebrew congregation was written very likely before the year 70 AD. Less than 40 years on from the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and already there are people in this particular congregation who are making it a habit to not regularly meet together. Isn't that amazing? Why? Well, we're not told in this text, but there are some other things within the letter of Hebrews and some other documents that we can piece together that we can be pretty certain about, of reasons why this may have been happening. One very likely reason that members of this church were neglecting to meet together was fear of Roman persecution. We're told elsewhere in Hebrews that people in this local church had been thrown in jail. They'd had their property confiscated. They'd been humiliated. Some were even facing death. Another very likely common reason was the fear of being shunned by your Jewish family. Right? You want to go follow this so-called Messiah? Fine, just don't come back here. Others might have been embarrassed at the small size of the church compared to the larger and more well-attended synagogues. Some of them, it may have been an issue of their livelihood, what kind of job they could do if they claimed this faith. For some of them, no doubt it was just plain old apathy and indifference. But as you can see, and this is important, none of those reasons appear in this text, do they? You know why? Because at the end of the day, they don't really matter. In the final analysis, there is no sufficient reason. Ultimately, all of these reasons reveal a failure to take the obligation of this ministry to each other as a response to the gospel, remember. It's a failure to take it seriously. It really couldn't be put any clearer here. This ministry of inciting one another to love and good works cannot be practiced until a Christian identifies with a specific local congregation and regularly attends the scheduled meetings of that church. So what am I saying? That you better not miss a Sunday? That you can't take a vacation? What if your job requires you to work on Sunday? It's really asking the wrong question. Imagine this. Imagine a brand new mom who comes to you and asks, how often do I have to kiss my baby? Once a month? Twice a month? Every week? She doesn't have a kissing problem. She has a heart problem, right? And my point is that kissing a new baby isn't something that should ever have to be mandated, right? It should be the longing of every parent's heart to kiss their new baby. So listen, if you're sick, stay home from church. I hope you do. Go on vacation. I'll be gone in a couple of weeks. And if you happen to work on Sundays, God bless you. Do your work as an expression of worship to the Lord. I happen to work on Sundays. As some of you like to remind me, it's the one day that I do work, right? We're asking the wrong questions. Don't ask, how often do you have to kiss your baby? Okay? It should be the longing of your heart to be with God's people when they gather. Honestly, guys, I love being here with you all on Sundays. and on Wednesday nights when we gather for prayer, and with the Joshua Journey guys once a month, and when we pick up the men's Bible study again in the fall. Not because it's my job, it's because that's where I want to be. Church isn't something you drag yourself to. There's not a minimum requirement to fulfill here. We shouldn't even be thinking in those kinds of terms in this place. Okay? It should be the longing of your heart. Here's why. Because you have a responsibility, an obligation to engage in ministry on behalf of your brothers and sisters who are here. You see? So how can you, if you've never done this kind of thing before, where do you start? How can you get started? Recognize this ministry is your responsibility. Recognize it takes deliberate reflection. Recognize that it requires consistent togetherness. And finally, recognize that this ministry expresses itself in verbal encouragement. This ministry of inciting each other expresses itself in verbal encouragement. Okay, let's read this again here. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. Now, this word encouraging can mean a variety of things, really. It can mean to comfort, to counsel, to help, to admonish, to urge, to strengthen. And yet all of those things, all of those meanings have one thing in common. They involve words. This is a verbal ministry. This ministry of inciting each other to love and good works means applying appropriate and timely words to each other. A word of affection. A word of appreciation. A word of admonition, a word of comfort, a word of counseling, a word of confrontation. This can come to you maybe through a sermon. This can maybe come to you through a worship song. But given the fact that the emphasis here in Hebrews is on this gospel obligation of all Christians, it's much more likely to be lived out in a very direct, personal, one-on-one type of way. Hey, John, thanks for the sermon a few weeks ago. I really learned a lot about the importance of prayer when you preached that. Thank you. Sam, thanks for putting together the video for the VBS. You do a lot of things like that behind the scenes that not everybody realizes, and I appreciate it. David, tell Tricia when she gets back, thank you for taking the lead on that VBS program. That was really great to see. Ippolito, thanks for taking the lead on getting that room painted back there. That was a lot of work, took a lot of time, and we appreciate it. Or, it may look like this. Hey, brother, you seem really burdened lately. Is there anything that I can be doing for you? Or, hey, sister, I wanted you to know that I'm praying for you this week, especially about that family member that you have who wants nothing to do with the gospel. I'm praying for you. Or, hey friend, you know that I love you. It's why I need to speak with you about this sinful pattern in your life. And what do these various forms of verbal encouragement produce? More love and good works. Further expressions of genuine Christianity. You get the idea? You see what's going on here? It's a snowball effect. Love produces love. Love begets more love. Isn't that true? Don't you feel like that? When you've been encouraged, what do you want to do? I want to go and encourage somebody else. That's how I feel. When this kind of thing happens to me, it spurs me on. It excites me, and it makes me want to go be that kind of blessing for somebody else. And notice how important this is. Back in the verse, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, watch now, and all the more as you see the day is drawing near. I'm so glad that line is there, because it takes away some of the very typical excuses that are offered up of why we don't do this. yeah, I know what it says, but we don't live at a first century pace anymore. We're in a high-paced world. We can't be expected to do this, to show up regularly when the church meets, to know each other well enough to speak an appropriate word of encouragement or rebuke or whatever into people's lives. That's why we have Facebook, isn't it? But you see, the author here insists that the very opposite is true. In other words, he says, as we draw closer and closer to the return of Jesus Christ, that is the day he's talking about, the more important this ministry of inciting each other becomes, and your obligation to practice it. You need this more today than you did yesterday. You'll need it more tomorrow than you need it today. We need it in increasing doses here, you see? Church, we are so much more than a room full of autonomous individuals who get together for an hour and a half to hear a sermon and sing some songs and pray. We are a people saved by the gospel for the purpose of living out responses to the gospel in our mutual lives together. And this ministry of inciting each other, of provoking each other to love and to good works is among the most important of our responses to the gospel. And it's something that we need more and more as time runs out. You are your brother's keeper. We have to renounce the spirit of rugged individualism when it comes to the church. It has no place here. Perseverance is a community project. And despite what the law of the land guarantees, when you embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, you surrender the right to not act in the best interest of another brother or sister. That is not an option for you. You do have a duty to rescue. Now, is this how you think about the church? I want you to imagine something with me here, okay? I counted it up this week. Do you realize that if everybody who sort of semi-regularly attends here showed up on the same Sunday, we'd have something like 175 people in the building? Now, forget about the number. Imagine this. What would it be like if every one of those people, before they came to this place each week, first carefully considered the needs of the other people who would be here and how they might best encourage them? What would this church be like? I think that if we actually understood this is our obligation as Christians and stepped up and lived this way, you wouldn't be able to keep people away from this place. Can you imagine? Can you dream with me of a church that preaches the gospel and sings the gospel and is made up of people who, because of the gospel, deliberately live out the obligations of the gospel in their relationships with each other? You know what it would be like? A slice of heaven on earth. If you are part of this local church, you are your brothers and sisters' keepers. This is why we gather.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.